Yo, how's it going everybody? You got Sketch here and welcome back to the channel. On this episode we're taking a look at the sequel of a game we covered last year from Surreal Software. We're checking out The Suffering, Ties That Bind, developed by Surreal Software and published by Midway Games for the PlayStation 2, original Xbox, and PC in 2005. The sequel to the original entry continues the journey of Torque as he returns to Baltimore after the Abbott State incident. It also has a familiar feel to the last entry while making several changes. But before we get too much further, let's catch up on the story. As we jump back into the role of Torque, we pick up immediately after the ending of the last game. Depending on choices made last time, we'll also start the game one of three ways, more so if using the same memory card with your previous clear on the original. Instead of the confines of the Abbott State Penitentiary, you'll traverse the city of Baltimore, Maryland. The game's prologue begins 5 years prior to the last entry, cutting you into a mysterious warehouse. You then discover the information that I won't spoil here, and will seek out the infamous mob boss Blackmore. Meanwhile, it also becomes apparent that the malefactors from the last time have now descended upon the city, and it's up to you to stop them once again. Gameplay-wise, you've got a first-person shooter where you can switch between third-person perspective at any time, much like the original entry. You'll have 18 missions on offer, ranging from the Abbott State Penitentiary, which will eventually spread out into the city of Baltimore. The cityscape creates some interesting combat scenarios, and the malefactors will constantly be on your back. Once you feel your insanity meter, you can also unleash the inner demon and melee attack enemies and certain environmental elements to move along the levels. Levels remain mostly linear while expanding into the city, allowing you to find some items and trinkets. You get a good variety of weaponry this time around, now including pipes and various throwable weapons like grenades and molotovs, along with a nice spread of ranged weapons. Several weapons make a return like the revolver, 1911 pistol, shotgun, and Tommy gun, while seeing the new coming Scorpion SMGs, double barrel shotgun, grease gun, and grenade launcher. There's also an endless buffet of obstacles around each arena, so you can get pretty spicy depending on how you want to go about each battle. Much like the original, it's got a lot of action off the rip as it retells the opening segments pertaining to the Abbott State incident. Once you're in the city proper, a variety of new and returning enemy types will be there to greet you with either a needle or a bullet to the face. The malefactors are one thing to deal with, but there's also numerous human enemies at your throat on your tour of Baltimore. The platforming also returns from the last game, and for those that played the original, it's easier to tell what you can climb on and into, which is much more obvious than before. The morality system also returns, and once again gives you choices of who to help and who to punish along your journey. The moral quandaries will present themselves in a variety of ways, much like last time, and your choices will steer your possible endings one of three ways, either being good, neutral, or evil. Helping passersby can at times be a bit of a curveball, and the game will spring some heavy subject matter on you during these sections. Combat, much like the original, also feels good here, allowing you to dispatch your ops in spectacular gory fashion. A lot of the weapons here will literally shred your enemies like printer paper, and you'll encounter waves of them as you paint the streets red. Switching back and forth between first and third perspective, depending on preference, also works well here, letting you do as much or as little as you'd like in each perspective, not forcing you to be locked to one or the other. Whichever you decide, the action and movement never feels disjointed and plays smoothly at all times. At a base, it all seems pretty familiar until you notice how many gameplay changes are also present, such as weapon and item limits. Unlike the original entry, you can no longer hold multiple weapons and now have a 2-weapon limit. There's also a limit on zombie and bottles, where instead of being able to stack them, you can only take them until your health bar is full, but can't hold any extra. These may not seem like a big deal, but it can potentially put you in a rough spot if you're low on health or ammo going into some of those more heated encounters, of which you'll see a lot of. In certain situations, there'll be enough ammo and health pickups to keep you moving, but sometimes you might get pinched, more so if you're getting swarmed by numerous enemies at once. The boss battles can also get pretty hectic, especially the final encounter with Blackmore, considering he can only be damaged when you're in beast mode. Waves of enemies will spawn in to build your meter, but if you mess up before it's over, you've got to start over since there's no main encounter checkpoints. I got pretty unlucky with this game, in particular experiencing a lot of crashes and bugs in the beginning and middle sections of the game. I know these can contribute to scratches on the disc, but it's still recommended to save often, just as to not have to repeat whole stages, and keep multiple saves just in case you get caught up in a death loop, since if you save on a bug section, that will carry over verbatim, essentially corrupting your game. I'm sure it's an isolated incident, but having to start over halfway through the game due to crucial events not triggering and a couple of endless load screens can be frustrating. Graphics wise, The Suffering, Ties That Bind runs on the right engine, and this does look a bit better than the original entry. The lighting and gore effects have been amplified quite a few notches compared to our last outing with Torque, and the amount of carnage that unfolds on screen here is actually pretty impressive, even surpassing what they achieved with the last game. The environments as you tour Baltimore look pretty good here, and the backdrops of night as you move amongst the city is pretty sick. The neon signs and street lamps cast light and shadows along the streets, and the interiors as you explore more of the areas have some pretty decent detail. The rundown buildings and landmarks around town have that gritty urban aesthetic dialed, and the visuals of your surroundings are pretty solid in general. Character models revive several of the past enemy types seen in the original game while adding in new, equally terrifying foes on the field. Where the enemies were made to represent forms of punishment in the last game, along with those enemies are new ones introduced that pertain to various levels of street crime. The Triggerman, Mainliners, and Burrowers return from the previous game with an updated design, among several new enemy types like the Isolationist, Marksman, and the Creeper, which is a particularly gnarly looking creation. Returning enemies also got a new coat of paint, while the new ones got some downright ghastly designs about them. The gore effects here also get dialed up a notch, often leaving Torque covered in viscera of slain enemies. The level of detail leaves blood splatter on your weapons, while in first person mode, depending on how close you are to your enemies during combat and how you finish them off. So the attention to detail here is actually pretty stellar. You can jib your enemies in spectacular fashion with your assortment of weapons, which can straight up delete a lot of your ops. The in-game cutscenes are a slight cut above the original entry, with a bit more in the way of visual filters and effects work. These parts, much like the last game, deal with some at times heavy subject matter, ranging from the horrors of prison life, substance abuse, crime, and dark spots of history. The visuals that coincide with the narrative can paint some pretty bleak images along the way, and several striking ones in the process. Weapon animations as well as fire and explosion effects cook out here like a summertime campfire, and the visual detail here is a couple of notches better than the last time. Weapons have an updated look here with a bit more sheen, coupled with its updated heads-up display, which is now textured on the insanity meter. So from a visual standpoint, the differences are noticeable. Sound-wise, there's a good bit going on here between the effects work and the scripted dialogue, which can go a variety of ways. Composers Eric Aho and Boyd Post handle the music and sound design this go around, and it retains majority of what we heard in the first game as far as the tone and scope of its soundtrack. You get those moments of ambient sound as you go up and down the streets, with the occasional orchestral stab, much like the original. The Shining vibe still comes through in its sequel just as much as it did on its predecessor. The voice acting is also on par with the original, with several additional talents involved with the project. The likes of Michael Clark Duncan voicing Blackmore, Rachel Griffith voicing Jordan, and Scott Bullock, just to name a few. Performances are solid here, and as mentioned earlier, parts of the dialogue do get dark and delve into some pretty serious content from several perspectives, depending on in-game choices. The moments where you have flashbacks pertaining to your spouse and family can be particularly intense bits. You'll also meet several NPCs that will also have a few dialogue lines along the journey. Weapon audio is also decent here, much like the original, with shotguns that bark like an angry Rottweiler, to the sounds of breaking glass as a Molotov cocktail ignites its target. Enemies also have their own signature vocal gestures when they're on the board, so there's a good bit to listen out for. Explosions also have a good bit of bass here, and the attention to detail is again pretty damn good overall with its audio. In closing, The Suffering Ties That Bind is essentially more of the same from the first entry, with a handful of minor and major changes. The story is good enough to carry through the campaign, and much like the original, has got some heavy moments. What it's also got is a challenging shooter that will paint some horrific scenes during its run. For those into more cerebral horror coupled with a breakneck action game, this is a pretty solid deal. Though it is tough to recommend this one over the original, not to say it isn't also good, it's just not quite as good as the original, which crafted a truly unique experience. This one follows it up closely, and is still worth the play if you see it in your local area, or online for a good deal. The Suffering Ties That Bind gets a 7.5 out of 10 and comes recommended to horror game fans as well as fans of FPS and third-person shooters. This is a solid continuation from the first game, even if it doesn't quite hit as hard as the original from a gameplay standpoint. Considering it only came out a year after the original, it's interesting to see how much they improved on so quickly. While the weapon and item limit may be cumbersome from players, it's not long before you adapt to the challenge and its comparative curveballs. It makes me wonder what may have been if this had panned out into the multi-game cycle as well as the feature film that was initially planned, but these two titles remain solid games to run through during Halloween, or really anytime the mood strikes for a gritty horror game that will keep you on your toes and mess with your head a bit. The Xbox and PS2 versions run for about $15 to $20 loose, and around $30 for complete NTSC copies on average. And I thank you again if you made it this far into the video. If you find this video helpful, that's awesome. I'm glad you can use it as a resource. Check back often. We'll have more reviews and commentaries come up in the near future. But until then, stay safe out there and take it easy. I'll see you on the next one.